Sup people, Multiplier here. What I thought I'd do today is basically a long overdue mastering tutorial, and I'm basically going to be showing you how I mastered the track I just finished, which is called The Heavy. And I thought it'd be a good example, mainly because it's quite simple to see what's going on this particular track, and I think it demonstrates a few kind of super key, super fundamental points about mastering, so ideal. Also, considering I haven't really posted up a preview of this new track yet, partly because I finished it yesterday, what I thought I'd do is just play the whole thing through as well. So if you're here just mostly for the mastering tutorial, you might just want to kind of skip through this next 4.5 minutes, although it might be worth listening to a bit of it just to get a feel for the vibe, so you know kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about mastering. But yeah, anyway, it's called The Heavy. I think I showed you kind of the work in progress of this in another video called Some Thoughts on Songwriting. So I finished the track, basically doing what I said in that last video. And yeah, super stoked on it. It's kind of more DJ friendly. It's got a lot of vibe, a lot of original sounds. Pretty much only my own sounds in. Yeah, pretty stoked on it. And I'm stoked on the mastering as well. So yeah, here it is. It's called The Heavy. Fuck knows what I'm actually going to do with it. Probably put it out for free. Dunno. See what I feel like in a week or two. Anyway, here it is. The Heavy. Rad. Pretty sweet, right? Anyway, yeah, that's the track. So yeah, now on to the mastering. So yeah, basically, what I did when mastering this was, first of all, I use isotope ozone to do all my mastering, which is basically, it's just a kind of a plugin that has all the bits of mastering all in one plugin. So it means I don't have to have a kind of a whole mastering chain. I can just do everything in one plugin. I know all the processing is really good. It just makes life a lot easier for me. So yeah, what did I do? So first thing I did was sort out the EQ. So in mastering, I'm a big believer in, especially when you're mastering your own stuff, you shouldn't have to do any radical EQing at the mastering stage. If you have to do any really radical stuff, whether it's some big cuts, some big boosts, or even any really big kind of shelving, either high or low, go back to the mix. It's your mix. You have the ability to go and fix it in the first place. It's the sort of thing you don't want to be kind of fudging it at the last minute if you can just get it right in the first place. So if you have to do anything drastic, go back to the mix and get it right. So I happen to know, because I listened to a rough cut of this track in kind of my car and my headphones, and a few different headphones in a few different places before I got to this mastering stage. So I had a suspicion that it was a little bit kind of bass heavy, and the trebles were a little bit kind of, it was a little bit kind of lopsided. So the bass was a little bit, well, there wasn't enough treble basically. And then what I did is basically, by using the snapshots feature in the EQ bit of Ozone, I kind of confirmed my suspicions, which just kind of reassured me that my ears were telling me the right thing. And yeah, so have a look at snapshots if you have isotope ozone. But basically all snapshots does is it gives you kind of a long-term image of kind of the spread of the different frequencies. And then I have a reference track, which happens to be Knife Party Bonfire. So I know by looking at the snapshot of my track, comparing that to Bonfire, which is the one that I always use, so I know that one really well. You just get a feel for it the more you do it. And I could see that the treble needed a bit of a boost. So what I did, the EQ bands, got one of the analog high shelves. I'm pretty sure it's an analog high shelf. Yeah, the analog high shelf. Bumped it up a dB or so. I felt that was about right. Just gave it a little bit of treble back in there. It's quite a simple track in terms of the elements in it, so you can get away with that kind of thing. And because it's an analog modeled high shelf as well, just gives you that very bit of subtle kind of analoginess to it. So I don't know if any of you saw my Facebook post I did today, but if you're doing kind of deep surgical cuts or boosts, try and use a digital modeled filter. Just because when you're doing drastic things, you want to do it as cleanly as possible. But if you're just doing subtle stuff, having that analog modeled kind of inaccuracy results in some quite musical inaccuracy. So it's perfectly cool to use analog modeled stuff for very basic kind of EQ stuff. So you can see this red line here. It's reasonably subtle kind of EQ curve, just kind of boosting the balance a bit of the treble versus the bass. Nice and simple. So after I did that, the next thing that I do on pretty much all my tracks is widen the stereo image. So this is just a personal thing of mine. It's not for everyone. Wouldn't say it's my kind of USP as such, but it's something that I tend to do on pretty much all my tracks, which is use on the stereo imaging tab on Isotope Ozone. There's a preset called Widespread. And what that basically does is it splits everything into 4 bands, and then as you kind of work your way up from the bass to the mids, and then to the high mids, and then the highs, it kind of widens it progressively more and more. So you can see with these bands that it's not widening the bass anymore, making the mids slightly wider, making the top mids even wider still, and the very, very tops really wide. And that's just based on kind of like standard mixing theory, and it just works really well. So it's not 100% necessary. But I find very, 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 very rarely does kind of widening those upper frequencies kind of really wide. That sentence doesn't make any sense. Yeah, almost always sticking that preset on, just kind of widening the highs results in a better sounding track. That sentence made sense. So yeah, you can either use, if you have Ozone, it's got an amazing stereo imager, but there are tons of plugins that do the same thing. or you can kind of create your own with a bunch of EQs and utilities and stuff. But yeah, there's lots of ways of doing it. But yeah, stereo imaging and kind of widening various frequency bands is certainly something that is worth looking into if you find your tracks aren't quite wide enough, especially towards the top end of frequencies. And yeah, it's also worth definitely treating the bass differently to the top end in terms of width, which I probably do a video on another stage. But in simple terms, you want your bass sounds in the middle and then your high frequency stuff more to the side. It's a complicated reason as to why, but that's the basic idea. So we've got our EQ sorted. We've got our basic kind of balance of frequencies kind of dialed. We've widened the top frequencies a bit, which also makes the top frequencies a bit louder as well. That's kind of how it works. So you have to kind of factor that into your EQ a bit as well. And then the next thing I did was I used the limiter. So I'm not going to explain in detail kind of how the limiter works. In Ozone, it's called Maximizer. But basically, the idea is you basically got a threshold, and anything that's above this threshold basically almost like gets the top cut off. Now, it's not quite as kind of black and white as that, but that's the basic idea. Any input that's above minus 9.1 decibels has the top chopped off. And then what happens is the whole thing gets turned up. So the limiter, in effect, makes the whole thing louder. Now, how did I set the threshold? That's kind of the crucial thing. Well, because I made the track, I could basically have a look and see exactly where my kicks were hitting. So I had a look at the kind of the level meter for the kicks, and I saw that they were hitting roughly -9. And then because of the fact I've analysed tracks and I kind of know the way that dance music works, I know that I basically want the kicks to be hitting 0. So the way that I do that is I make sure I turn the threshold for the limiter down to at least -9, if that makes sense. So it's kind of an advantage of making the track yourself and then mastering it, is you know at least roughly the right threshold to set your limiter at, just to kind of keep everything balanced and keep everything in check. Because if I'd made the threshold a lot lower than -9, then it would have been squashing the kicks too much. If I made it kind of say -7 or -6, then the limiter wouldn't have necessarily been doing that much, and the kicks wouldn't have been necessarily hitting 0. So it's worth definitely, if you know what level your kicks are hitting, you know roughly what level to set your threshold of your limiter. Now, obviously, you need to tweak it a bit, and hopefully, if you have a limiter, you'll see some sort of gain reduction kind of meter or graph displaying what's triggering the limiter. So using a combination of knowing where the kicks hit and your kind of metering, you can see what's kind of triggering the limiter, basically. So it's worth kind of, whenever I'm mixing and mastering and even producing, I'm always having like a mental visualization of the waveform, because that's the best way to kind of know what to set things at. Because using your ears, it's quite hard to figure out, / almost impossible, apart from just playing around with it, figuring out what setting to set certain controls at, especially when it comes to compressors and limiters. But if you just use your eyes and kind of visualize it, you can kind of imagine what processing is happening to what wave, and then you know what settings to have a processing unit to do to then get your kind of desired result. So definitely it's something that I know a lot of other producers do. Get used to the idea of visualizing your waveform, and that way you can kind of imagine what's going on, and then also then kind of correlate that to what's going on with your metering and your plugins. Hopefully they have some sort of metering. Sweet. So that's kind of the threshold of the limiter. Now it's worth noting I chose in Ozone IRC3 setting. Now this is only really specific to people who have Ozone, but this is basically Ozone's best limiting algorithm. So it's really good. You can crank it really hard through this limiting algorithm, and it's really good at not producing artifacts. IRC3 is quite intensive on your computer, but I have a pretty pimping Mac, so that's all good for me. You've also got this intersample detection turned on. Again, it's quite specific to this particular plugin. But it basically just fixes a bunch of technicalities with the processing. Don't really need to learn what it is. Just whack it on if you can be bothered. And then the other important setting, well, one of the other important settings, is this character slider. So this is kind of analogous to the speed of the release on like the limiter, but because it's an intelligent limiter, it's not technically the release. It's kind of like the release. So it's a simple case of starting it with the slider somewhere near the middle, and then just kind of using a combination of my ears and then this kind of metering thing, displaying what's happening to the waveform as the limiter was being triggered. I kind of dialed in the exact point. So in general, the basic idea when setting a threshold and the speed of the release of the limiter is to set it roughly where you know, and then almost just keep turning it up, keep making it louder until the point where you notice either you're hearing artifacts or it's squashing the sound too much, and then tone it back a bit. And then the idea of like having fresh ears and not getting used to the way something sounds is really, really important. So keep kind of going back to other settings to make sure you're not just getting used to a really bad quality sound, if that makes sense. So yeah, keep playing about with it, and don't be afraid to bounce out a few different versions kind of the limiter settings, because they're probably the most important of all the settings in terms of how kind of loud and how squashed you want it. It's all about finding that right balance. And then there's also another really, really important setting called the margin. I'm probably going to do a whole video on this just because it's a thing that I did a post about a while ago and not many people seem to know what it did. But the margin basically leaves an amount of headroom on your track set to whatever you set it to. So here it's set to minus 0.5, which means that my final output has at least or about minus 0.5 dB of headroom. So you can see on the master over here, it said minus 0.53, and that kind of agrees with the margin I've set in my limiter. Now, the reason you want to set a margin is, especially if you're exporting, say, a WAV, and then you know you're going to be converting it to MP3 later, you need to leave this bit of headroom so that when it's then converted to MP3 later, you hopefully don't get any artifacts. Because whenever you do that conversion to a lower bit rate or to a different sample rate or whatever, or even just compression in general, which is what MP3s are, it can create a bunch of... It basically needs a bit of headroom to do the conversion without producing a bunch of artifacts. So some tracks you can get away with a really low margin, especially if there's a lot of distortion because it kind of hides the artifacts. But if you've noticed, say, on SoundCloud, your tracks, especially around your bass, is producing a bunch of artifacts. It's because when SoundCloud does their conversion to 128K MP3, you haven't given them enough margin to do the conversion without producing those artifacts. So that also explains why some of you may be wondering why your bass sound a little bit kind of paper foldy when just the bass sound is playing. Set yourself a big margin. 0.3 is about the standard, but I personally have now started using 0.5 just because it's perfectly fine to have 0.5. Your track's not too quiet. You can always turn it up anyway, but it just gives you that tons of safety room you need. Sweet. So that's the limiter, which is super important. And then after that, normally what I would do is potentially go into the dynamic setting, which is the compressors. So in Ozone, you've got kind of multi-band compression if I wanted, and it does a bit of gating, a bit of limiting as well. Personally, because of the nature of the track I made and the fact that I made the track myself, I didn't need to do any compression. So I know a lot of people just seem to have it in their head that compression is good and you must be compressing, and if you're not compressing, you're not doing it right, and let's just whack compressors on everything. Well, no. If you're making your sounds yourself, I personally think, and I'm definitely right because I'm definitely right, if you're making your sounds yourself, just make them right in the first place. You don't need to then compress it. Your limiter will kind of glue everything together and make it loud. You just don't really need to do compression if you're making your sounds yourself. You just don't need to. You're more likely gonna ruin it than you are to make it better. And it's a bit like if you're making a synth sound, why don't you just make it right in the first place? Or if you're making a kick sound, why don't you just... Actually, that's probably a bad example because kicks... Yeah, if you've got a kick sample, say, that someone else made perfect with compression, you don't then want to have to compress it over the top. You're going to ruin it. Whoever made it perfect. So leave it alone. So in this particular case, I didn't need to do any compression. Now, sometimes I do. Depends if I've kind of made the track properly in the first place. Or if you have tons and tons of elements and you haven't quite mixed it too accurately, but you quite like how it's balanced and you then don't want to have to go and rebalance it all, you can sometimes dip into the compression settings on your master channel to kind of fix it. But to be honest, just get it right in the first place. In this case, I got it right in the first place. Didn't need to use compression. Said that about 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 times now, just because it's a super important point that I think a lot of you, not pointing out anyone in particular, but it's something that I get asked about quite a lot, and a lot of people just aren't really using it correctly because it's difficult. Using compressors correctly is difficult. There's no getting around it. Yeah, pretty cool. So that's kind of compression ignored. Well, not ignored, but purposefully not used is probably more accurate. And then the final little thing I did for mastering was I used this harmonic exciter. So it's something that a lot of people are doing, not everyone's doing, but it's basically harmonic exciting is a technical term for distortion. Now distortion can be good, it can be bad, but used correctly, that's basically what all music is. Distortion is the essence of music and tonality. So in this particular case, what I'm a big fan of doing in Ozone is just running through the presets. I used Invisible Lift here just because it sounded pretty good with the sounds I'd made in the first place. Now this particular preset definitely added a bit of character to it. I could run you through these settings, but basically if you've used the exciter in Ozone, you'll see that it's a slightly aggressive exciter, like you can definitely hear the difference. It just adds a bit of kind of sharpness, a bit of sizzle, a bit of kind of crunchiness, but in a nice way. So it's definitely a case of just kind of flick through maybe some exciting presets or maybe do your own, but it just gives it a bit of extra character, a bit of extra kind of shine, as it were. Not necessary depending on how you made your track in the first place, but given that there weren't too many elements in my kind of mix, there's only really the bass as the kind of the main element, there was certainly tons of room for me to add kind of sizzle and shine and a few little subtleties to it, because it's a case of if I had, say, like 6 different main elements all playing at the same time, like sub, bass, midline, top line, vocal, all that kind of stuff, and you see, yeah, kind of the subtleties can be kind of overlooked just because it all gets mashed into one. But when you've only got a few elements involved, you really have to try and make each one shine, which also happens to be the reason that the trap or the kind of big room house that most people are making pretty much sucks, is because they seem to think that you can overlook the details. But when you've only got like 3 elements or 2 elements or 1 main element, you can't overlook the details because there's no hiding room. But there is hiding room if you have tons of elements. That's also worth knowing. But yeah, in this particular case, there was room for me to kind of add some cool subtlety to it. But yeah, that was exciting. And then after that, I have the oversampling selected, which is pretty good. It's worth noting, if you have Ozone, the oversampling button basically uses more processing power, but it makes your final result sound better. So what you can do, if you're not running a really pimping Mac or a pimping PC, untick oversampling just to save yourself some CPU power. But then when you go to render out the track, whack the oversampling button, just so you kind of get the best sound quality as a result. Similarly, you can do that with your IRC modes as well. So if you find IRC3 is too intense for your computer, choose IRC2, dial in the settings, and then just whack it over to IRC3 for your final render. But sweet, that's pretty much it. I did check the track on a whole bunch of different speakers after I finished it, and I also imported it into Tractor. So in fact, what I will do is import it into Tractor to show you the things that I noticed being correct about my track. So let's load up Tractor. Now it's worth noting the working title for this track was Growler, which is why I'm grabbing Growler. Changed the name to Heavy about 20 minutes ago. Yeah, so I loaded the track into Tractor, loaded it twice so the auto gain settings worked. And now when I click this little button here, it displayed the auto gain settings. And this is basically a really accurate way to measure loudness. So I know, because I use Tractor a lot, that -1.2 is sufficiently loud, and it's about right for the genre of music I'm making. It's not too loud, so it's not kind of overly squished, so it's still got a lot of dynamics and a lot of cool stuff in, but it's certainly sufficiently loud. And yeah, it's pretty cool. So you notice looking at the waveform here, there's a lot of red going on, which means those of you who use Traktor know there's a lot of bass, but that's to be expected. You'll also notice that's just as we want, the kicks are hitting 0. So on these kind of beats, the kicks are are reaching the peak, the loud bit. And then the bass is also, because we want the bass to be quite big and bold, it's pretty much hitting the 0 bit as well. But it's very slightly behind the kicks, which is good. So you see there's a little bit of a gap between the kicks and the bass. Just because fundamentally, it's dance music, stick it in a club, you need a big beat to be dominating. So based on just looking at the waveform, I felt that there was enough dynamics and it was loud enough still for it to be a good master. And then it wasn't too red as well, which is also worth noting. Also in these kind of breaks as well, it's about the right sort of height, which means I know it's the right sort of loudness in the breaks, which is cool. Yeah, everything kind of checked out in Traktor. And then it was all good. And then that's pretty much it. Wow, how long is the video? 27 minutes, crikey. That was a long video, but you guys have been asking me for a mastering video for ages, and I did a bunch of really shit ones. So yeah, it's about time I did a proper mastering video with an example. So what I might do, depending on if you guys like it or if I can be bothered, I might do maybe the next track I do just after I master it. I'll show you how I mastered that one. Because it's all well and good me talking theory, but without kind of showing you and explaining with a track, it can be quite hard to understand. But fundamentally, you need to just analyze tracks you like, practice, analyze your results, reference tracks you like, and repeat. Just keep doing it. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. It's definitely a case of you can't really learn this thing in an hour and then be any good at it. So yeah, cool stuff. I've been Multiplier. It's been how to master, or how I mastered. I'm not even sure what I'm going to call this video. Might call it mastering tutorial brackets with example, or I might call it how I mastered the heavy. Anyway, hopefully this track will be out soonish. I've got to figure out what I'm going to do with it. Cool stuff. Enjoy mastering. Oh yeah, I probably should have said this earlier, but everything I just said applies to any mastering chain. You don't have to use Ozone, but yeah, cool stuff. Sweet.